Hello, my name is Cedric Chippendale. When I took my first job, I was given counsel by an older person who said to me, Cedric, I want you to remember that it's not what you know, but who you know. And what he meant by that is I could benefit much more by knowing the right people and socially connecting myself with people who are strategically placed within the organization, who would open doors for me rather than depending upon my training and my talents. In essence, what he was saying to me is that opportunities in this life are often the results of my connections with other people who are strategically placed rather than depending on my talents or my knowledge or even the quality of my work. As we continue our study in Mark chapter 5, as Jesus was mentoring his disciples for the task that he would give them after he was resurrected, and that is to prepare them to take the gospel to every nation. We will look at two women, one being socially isolated because she was afflicted with a chronic disorder that caused her to bleed all the time. And as a result, anyone who touched her was ceremonially unclean. So she became socially isolated. She was abandoned by everyone, and she was bankrupt. She did not know anyone who could or who would make intercession for her or represent her before the higher authorities, as it were. She was, in essence, the antithesis of this saying that I was taught. It's not what you know, but who you know. She did not know anyone who would open doors for her. Next week we will look at another lady, actually a preteen who was 12 years old, who was on the high end of the hierarchy in terms of the social structure of the day. She was connected through a father who was a prominent member of the society. Her father was a man by the name of Jairus who managed the synagogue, the local synagogue, and who knew the right people. And in this case, we find him interceding on her behalf. Because when Jesus got off the boat, after the encounter with the demoniac, he was met by Jairus, who fell on his knees at the feet of Jesus, begging him to come along. He said to Jesus in Mark chapter 5, verse 23, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her in order that she may be saved and live." Jesus agreed to go along with him. But on the other hand, Mark will focus our attention firstly on the one lady who is socially isolated. She is unnamed. She had this bleeding disorder, and she saw Jesus as the only one who could relieve her from this condition, who could deliver her. But the only problem is she had nobody who would approach Jesus on her behalf. And so she came up with her own plan. And her plan was quite a creative plan, in that she would come up behind Jesus and then touch his garment, and prayerfully and faithfully a condition will be relieved. And so Jesus goes along with Jairus, who said to him, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come to her assistance." Jesus displays that he is willing to adjust his own schedule to accommodate this emergency situation. And we read that on the way there, he was surrounded by a large crowd of people. And Mark tells us that this woman had a plan. And we read about her in chapter 5, verse 25 and 26 and 27. It says in verse 25, "And a woman who was hemorrhaging for 12 years and had suffered much at the hands of many doctors, had spent all that she had, and had not been helped. Rather, she had become worse. Having heard about Jesus, and having come behind him in the crowd, touched his garment. And now we get an insight into her internal dialogue. For she was saying in verse 28, "If I touch his garment, I shall be saved." That was the plan. No one to intercede, no one to represent her. So her plan was to come up behind Jesus covertly and grab hold of his garment. And Mark describes her action in 5 phrases. First of all, he tells us about the context, that there is a large crowd pressing against Jesus. And so it will be very, very difficult to distinguish between who's touching Jesus and who's not. But Mark tells us about her condition. In verse 25, he tells us that she was hemorrhaging or bleeding for 12 years. And so the continual bleeding, one presumes is gynecological, made her ceremonially unclean. And so anyone who came in close contact with her, whether it was a brother or husband, who would be ceremonially unclean, because that uncleanliness would be transferred to the person touching her. And so she was in a condition where no one could come near her. And this condition lasted for a period of 12 years. 12 years. And what Mark is underlining is the seriousness of her condition. And then he tells us what made the condition even worse. In verse 26, having suffered much under the hands of many doctors. And so this woman did not suffer in silence, but she went to the medical establishment of the day to seek help. But for 12 years, she consulted not one doctor, not 2 doctors, but many doctors. And in the process, she suffered under the medical care. So one has to imagine that they gave her solutions that was painful. She tried those solutions and treatments, and it made conditions even worse. And then Mark tells us exactly what happened next. He says in verse 26, the second part, she suffered much under the hands of many doctors, and she spent all that she had. So in seeking help from the medical establishment, she spent her entire income and then some in seeking help. But as a consequence, Mark tells us that the financial resources became drained, she became bankrupt. But in spite of the kind of investment she made, Mark gives us a summary and says she has not been helped. Her physical health became worse under the care of the doctors. She became financially bankrupt. She has lost all hope. And so Mark paints a picture of a woman who was desperate to find some form of relief from her condition. And so when Jesus came into town, she knew that he was her last hope. And then Mark tells us the action that she took. She touched his garment. Rather than directly approaching Jesus, she comes out behind him, and maybe in fear that she would make him ceremonially unclean because of her condition, she did not understand that his touching him did not make him ceremonially unclean, but touching him made her physically healed. And so the woman's internal dialogue is that if I touch his garment, I will be saved from this condition. And so Mark tells us that explains to us the action of this lady in verse 34. Having heard, she believed, and she touched. And that is the action of any disciple who believes in Jesus. She heard the truth about Jesus. She came to find out about Jesus. And then she touched him. And graphically, Mark tells us in verse 29 that immediately the flow of her blood dried up, and she knew in her body that she had been healed from her curse. And so the end of her ordeal has arrived. The 12 years of shame and frustration was resolved through a momentary touch of Jesus. That Mark and his disciples, hearing this, when they're reading this for the very first time, they begin to understand the concept that a touch of Jesus in faith brings about a complete and total healing, even after 12 years of hopeless suffering. And as a result of the woman's healing, we are told in verse 30, Jesus immediately perceives in himself that divine power has gone forth from him. In Mark and in the other Gospels, healing comes when Jesus touched people and when people touch Jesus. And so Jesus asked the question, after the power has left him, who touched my garment? And so even though he was being touched by many people around him, he perceived within himself that supernatural power has left him and brought about healing to someone in the crowd. And for the disciples, that was an absurd question. Who touched my garment? And they looked around and they must have said, but Lord, many people are touching you. How can you ask this absurd question, who touched my garment? Jesus turns around, he looks into the crowd in a penetrating fashion, and the woman comes forward in humility and trembling in fear because she knew that Jesus knew. And so she tells Jesus, this portion tells us the whole truth. And the whole truth would include her desire to be healed, a desire to be relieved from 12 years of suffering. And Jesus, in response to the woman's confession, as it were, gives a fourfold response of encouragement to the woman. First of all, he says to her, daughter, in verse 34. The woman that was once socially isolated, socially abandoned by everyone, enters into a relationship with Christ. Christ calls her a daughter, not a woman. And so immediately he tells her, your time for isolation or your time of isolation has ended. Because now you have entered into a relationship with me and I call you my daughter. And then he commends her faith. He says to her, your faith has saved you. And so Jesus confirms to this lady that by the touching of his garment, it became a manifestation of her confidence in Christ. And so Jesus, by touching Jesus' garment, it brought about healing in her body. And even though she was surrounded by a crowd, and even though Jesus was surrounded by a crowd, many people touching him, the touch that made the difference is that her touch on the garment of Jesus was a touch of faith. And so Jesus affirmed to her that your faith has saved you. And then he announces a blessing on her. He says, go in peace. It was a Hebrew way of saying shalom, that now you have found peace in your life. The bleeding has stopped. Your isolation has come to an end. You can be reconnected to society. So be blessed, go in peace. And then he affirms that the healing was permanent. He says to her, be healed of your affliction. And so he assures her and ratifies to her that what has taken place has been a permanent healing, and therefore she can go about her life and enjoy a life to the full, knowing that the condition that once plagued her has now been taken care of simply by a touch of Jesus. So, for many, many years, this woman was practically the living dead. But now, by simply touching Jesus, her isolation has ended and she has been restored to the wholeness of life. And so Jesus was building up his resume in answer to the question that was asked in chapter 4, who is this? Jesus is answering the question in layers. The first part we read by his stilling of the storm, that he is Lord over the storms. The second part by encountering the demoniac, he is Lord over the demons or the demonic world. And now with his encounter with this lady, he is teaching us and teaching them that he is Lord over illness. In the next section, he'll teach them, who is this that he is also Lord over death.